A recent study found that people spend roughly 5 hours a week feeling guilty on average. That may not seem like a lot of time, but it translates to about 5% of your waking hours devoted to one singular unpleasant emotion. And many people aren't sure how to manage guilt or how to make that feeling go away. As we learn more about guilt through research, it seems that some people are particularly prone to feeling guilty, which can make managing emotion even more challenging. But fortunately, there are things we can do to cope with this feeling, so it's far less impactful. Before we get into that though, let's start with a definition of guilt, or more specifically, look at the 4 key criteria, because I couldn't find a good short definition. So first, guilt can be mostly based on thought, or it can be more emotional, which can lead to strong feelings. Second, guilt doesn't have to be based on something true. Guilt can still occur even if we believe we should feel guilty, whether it's accurate or not. Third, to feel guilty, we have to violate a personal role or a universal standard that most people accept. So it's possible to feel guilty based on violating our own rules, and it's also possible to avoid feeling guilty if we violate a universal standard that we just don't accept. And fourth, guilt occurs when we feel significant responsibility for something we've done or perceive we've done. This also can help to explain why some people can admit wrongdoing, but if they don't feel it's that big of a deal, they don't feel much guilt. But you might be wondering, why do we experience guilt in the first place? In a 2007 study by Dr. David Amodio and colleagues, they set out to answer this question. But the help of a clever experiment design and an electroencephalography machine, also known as an EEG, they came away with some interesting findings. Results showed that the initial response to guilt is a desire to withdraw from the situation, likely because we're designed to avoid feelings of pain and discomfort. But next, there's a desire to re-engage and try to make things right. And this finding essentially combines 2 popular theories of guilt. First, guilt's about punishing the self. Second, guilt's about undoing the damage we've done. So now that we know what guilt's purpose could be, what's the next step? Ideally, to minimize the amount of time you feel guilty. And some of you might be wondering, what's wrong with feeling guilty? Well, nothing initially, it's just a signal like all other emotions. However, as you probably noticed, feeling guilty is a particularly pleasant emotion. And just like any uncomfortable emotion, it generally isn't helpful to remain in that emotional state for particularly long periods of time. In a 2006 study, Dr. Kenneth Kendler and colleagues, they examined 20,692 Swedish twins to determine which personality trait was most detrimental to mood. And what they found was that negative emotionality, which involves experiencing feelings of guilt as well as other negative emotions such as fear, jealousy, worry, envy, all proved to be the strongest risk factors for experiencing depression. So spending too much time drowning in negative emotions isn't helpful, and feeling a strong sense of guilt is a negative emotion. So now that we've established it's important to minimize the amount of time you feel guilty, let's look at my 5-step plan to help manage guilt. For my first step, it's important to identify when you feel guilty, and the best place to start is to become aware of how often you feel guilty over the course of a few days. Completing a thought record is a great way to help identify which thoughts and feelings create feelings of guilt, as well as the frequency and intensity of guilt. And this can be daunting for some, and some people are prone to feel guilty. And yes, guilt proneness is the thing, and it's not something I just made up. Based on a 2012 study, Dr. Taya Cohen and colleagues came away with a definition for this term, but I'll give you just the key 3 points. First, there's a tendency to feel bad even when it doesn't negatively impact others. Second, there can be a tendency to feel bad for thinking about doing something wrong. So if you haven't done it, you're just thinking about it. And third, there are consistent generalized feelings of guilt without even doing anything wrong. So this step is particularly important to complete because if you're experiencing guilt proneness, feeling guilty is likely becoming quite all-consuming. For my second step, you want to ask a better question. And the better question you want to ask is, what's fair in the situation? And if you can momentarily remove yourself from a particular thought or situation and insert someone else, what would be a fair standard of guilt to hold this person to? For example, let's assume you've had a particularly stressful day and you ask one of your children to unload the dishwasher. And let's assume that your children are a lot like my children and they don't seem interested in doing it, so they avoid the task. And you respond by saying, somewhat harshly, such as, why don't you ever listen? Do I have to do everything myself? And shortly after that, you reflect on what just happened and think that you're a terrible parent who's likely laying the groundwork for emotionally scarring your child for life. Now, let's pretend this scenario happened with someone else, perhaps a colleague at work who might not particularly know well. You may feel that answering a bit harshly and being unkind was not the right approach, but chances are you don't think that the single incident will emotionally scar their child for life. There's also a good chance that you don't feel they should lug around long-standing feelings of guilt about being an inadequate parent. Generally speaking, we tend to hold ourselves to a much higher standard and are much more harsh when judging ourselves than we'd ever be towards judging someone else. So now that you've attempted to approach guilty feelings logically, the next step is to put these thoughts or situations on trial and ultimately bow to the evidence. What I love about evidence is it helps to remove bias. Is there proof that you should feel guilty about a particular thought or situation? Once again, forget it's you for a moment. If you were a judge presiding over the situation, what would you decide? And the evidence needs to be compelling. Is it mostly true that you should feel guilty about this thought or situation? If the answer is no, your job is to let go of the guilt and continue on with your day. Life undoubtedly has other challenges for you, and you'll likely be in situations in the future where feeling guilty is warranted. If you're struggling to let go of the guilt, maybe this analogy will help. We established earlier, guilt causes us to feel bad for wrongdoing, so we'll act to make amends. In this case, guilt sending out a false message. So here's the analogy. Imagine hopping into your car, starting it up, putting on your seatbelt, and driving a block or two, only to have the seatbelt warning go off. It seems odd because your seatbelt's plugged in. A short distance later, the seatbelt warning goes again, but this time it's more persistent and annoying. And then you realize this is going to be a long, painful ride because that beep isn't going anywhere. So in this situation, the seatbelt warning beep's a false signal because your seatbelt's plugged in. There's nothing to be gained or changed by hearing the beep, and it's just annoying. And I'm sure you wouldn't feel guilty about it. If anything, you're probably annoyed because the seatbelt's plugged in and there's no purpose to the warning beep. But that's exactly what happens when someone continues to feel guilty even when there's no purpose. You need to respond to your guilt the same way you'd respond to the broken seatbelt warning. Well, to be fair, a bunch of swearing probably isn't going to fix the issue, but hopefully you've captured the spirit of the comparison. Acknowledge it's a false signal, let go of it to the best of your ability, and move on. What if you still can't let go of the feeling altogether? I suggest doing the next best thing, and that's to let go of the feeling for a short period of time and see what happens. You can always revisit how you feel later in the day. And be sure to ask yourself, did letting go of that feeling result in anything bad happening? Did you feel better letting it go? If you still find it difficult to let the feelings go, try rating how intense your feelings of guilt are on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 equals no guilt and 10 equals extreme guilt. And give your feeling of guilt a rating. Let's say it's an 8, which is fairly significant. And allow yourself to drop the feeling to a 5, which would be a moderate feeling of guilt just for a short period of time. With this approach, you haven't absolved yourself of all guilt. At least you're moving things in the right direction by allowing yourself to feel a little less guilty. Hopefully, you'll not only feel a bit better, but also begin to realize that there's truly nothing to be gained by carrying this feeling. There isn't something to make amends for. For step 4, it's time to address what to do if you found a thought or situation that warrants feeling guilty. And as mentioned earlier in this video, the first theory about guilt states that we should experience some pain when this happens. But how much pain and for how long, you ask? Well, there's no hard and fast rule on this one, but I can tell you this. It isn't particularly helpful to remain in pain for too long due to the negative impact on mental health. Ideally, you move relatively quickly towards the second purpose of guilt, which is to work towards alleviating feelings of guilt by making amends. As you learned earlier in this video, skipping this step can contribute to feelings of persistent guilt, which puts you at significant risk of developing a problem with mood. So now it's time to execute part 2 of the guilt equation, making amends. So depending on the situation, this could occur in countless ways, such as ranging from a simple apology to doing something corrective or extra special for the person you've hurt. So let's start with a situation that warrants a simple apology. For example, let's assume you've had a poor night's sleep and have a busy, stressful day ahead of you. You aren't very chatty in the morning, and your answers are fairly short and snappy. When you leave the house, you realize you were fairly cold and unengaged with your partner, children, or possibly both. Here would be a good example where a simple apology could be warranted, especially if this behavior is fairly atypical for you. Now for the more complex example. Let's assume you went out with your friends for a night of drinks and met someone at the bar you find attractive. You're married and it wasn't wise to go out of your way to communicate with this person. You make a poor decision and decide to interact with them throughout the evening. The night eventually ends with you kissing this person passionately. And it just so happens that a close friend of your partner was out that evening and was able to see what happened. Your partner ends up being informed about this, and you decide to come clean. Now, this would call for a far more complex apology that involves multiple steps. Based on a 2016 study by Dr. Ray Lewicki and colleagues, they developed a 6-step plan for giving an effective apology. To help make these steps real, I'm going to use this infidelity example I just mentioned and create an apology using these steps. So for the first step, it's important to express regret. For example, I'm sorry about what happened. I never should have risked our relationship or our family by doing this. Next, there could be an explanation of what went wrong. For instance, I didn't intend to act that way, but I think I just got caught up in the night. Someone paid attention to me, which made me feel good. The drinks made it worse, and I was more open to making bad decisions. I think I just rationalized in my head that it was just a one-time kiss. No one would ever know about it, so no one would get hurt. Third, there should be acknowledgement of responsibility. So, for example, this is 100% my fault. I know I've broken your trust, but I promise it'll never happen again. Now, the fourth step would involve a declaration of repentance. For instance, I feel terrible about it. I know I've done this extremely hurtful thing, and I put our family unit at risk. Next, it's important to have an offer of repair. So, again, for example, I promise to do whatever it takes to rebuild trust and make our marriage work. If you still want to be with me, I'll take things as slowly as you want. And for the sixth and final step is a request for forgiveness. For example, I know it's probably too early to ask, but I hope you can forgive me. It was incredibly hurtful, and I'm willing to work and earn your forgiveness. And of course, what's critical for an apology to work is that each step is conveyed with a feeling of sincerity. And one final but important note. It's crucial that you receive permission to make amends from the person you've hurt. If they're uninterested in you making amends, we'll look to tackle feeling of guilt in a different way. So for the fifth and final step, it's important to learn the lesson if you've done something wrong and then carry on. To apologize can be enough to appease feelings of guilt, but I think there's an important piece that's missing here. If a lesson isn't learned from the situation, there's a greater chance you can make the same mistake again. And if you're a parent, chances are good you've had a conversation with one of your children that goes something like this. I know you're sorry for what you've done, but it keeps happening. Just saying sorry isn't enough. This needs to stop. And for those who don't have children, chances are good you've probably had that conversation with a partner. Making mistakes is simply to be human. The point of making mistakes is to learn the lesson so you can avoid making the same mistake again in the future. Making the same mistake repeatedly when it can be prevented isn't the purpose of making mistakes. When you can learn from the mistake and prevent it from happening again, that's where growth happens. For example, let's switch gears a bit and go with a different type of example. Let's say you've been involved in a car accident and you were at fault. In this case, you slipped on ice, but when you think about it, you have a long-standing habit of driving well over the speed limit and don't really alter your driving based on elements. In other words, you don't slow down when it gets icy, snowy, foggy, dark, so on. So the lesson here could be to take the message to slow down in general and drive even more conservatively when the elements are difficult. This approach helps not only reduce your chance of being involved in future accidents, but also creates growth. This is a far better approach than simply feeling continuously guilty about being involved in an accident. And before I wrap up this video, I've added an extra bonus step to help you focus on letting go of guilt, given that this is often very difficult for people to do. It's not uncommon for people to make amends and learn the lesson about what they've done wrong, yet there's still remnants of guilt lying around. So this just means there's a little more work to do. So let's look at 2 techniques that can help to reduce feelings of guilt a little bit further. First, I suggest using the best friend test. With this test, since you want to imagine that your best friend is in your shoes and facing the same guilty predicament, would you judge your friend harshly? Chances are you wouldn't say the following to them. You know, you really should feel like crap. I hope you carry that guilt around forever. There's no forgiving that. Sounds a bit harsh, right? Unfortunately, this type of self-talk isn't all that uncommon. Imagine saying that to your best friend. You probably wouldn't. And if you did, how long would you have a best friend? And for the second technique, I suggest trying the rocking chair test. So this technique involves managing your future self at an older age with little time left. You're sitting in your rocking chair or rocking back and forth. You look back at your life and the quality you've had and wonder, what advice would you give to your younger self? Surely one of those things would be to try to enjoy your time as much as possible. This would surely mean more happiness, less anxiety, less anger, and of course, less guilt. Especially when many feelings of guilt were unwarranted, or when you learned the lesson and did your best to make amends and let the guilt go. So to provide a quick recap of the 5 steps for coping with guilt, first, it's important to identify when you feel guilt. A good place to start is to write down which thoughts and situations create feelings of guilt, as well as the frequency and intensity of these feelings over the course of a few days. Second, I want you to review the thoughts and situations that you've listed in your thought record and ask yourself, what would be an appropriate amount of guilt to feel for them? Or said another way, if someone else had these same thoughts or situations listed, how much guilt do you think they should feel? For my third strategy, it's important to examine the evidence. There's no factual reason to feel guilty. It's important to use the evidence to help let go of the guilt. If this is too difficult, practice letting go of the guilt for short periods. Fourth, if you found a thought or situation that warrants feeling guilty, use this discomfort for its intended purpose. Make amends to someone by giving a proper apology. And of course, you must have permission from the other person to offer that apology. For my fifth step, it's important to learn a lesson from the situation so the same mistake isn't repeated, and then let go of the guilt. And for a final bonus step, if you're still struggling to let go of guilt, try using the best friend test or the rocking chair test to provide further evidence and clarity for why you should let go of these feelings. So I hope you found these steps helpful. If you're interested in learning more about coping with feelings of guilt, please contact us at Sullivan Associates Clinical Psychology. If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.